All right, as we did last week, I was hoping that you all read Ruth, and we're going to not really read the scripture. They're pretty long readings in comparison. This week is actually a little shorter than the first 2 weeks, but I thought, well, I'll just refer to it, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you didn't read it, and perhaps you need to look at it. Anyway, in case you disagree with me, now almost nobody says they do. I don't believe that's true that they don't disagree. Oh, Renee, oh well, she does. Well, you tell me, you're one of them. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been taking a whole chapter of Ruth each week, and it's a massive literary work. It's 4 whole chapters. Okay, it takes about 30 minutes to an hour. If you're a slow reader like me, closer to 45 minutes maybe. But you can take time and read it, and it's a story that is a drama and a love story, and hard work is in the middle, and so you can see a rare snapshot of one family and how they're dealing with life and the troubles that they go through. And it's not in-depth, you got to remember a bunch of characters because it's only a couple of characters each week that we're dealing with. And so we know that there's a lot of things that aren't directly known about small family life, and we know a lot about the law because we read it in Scripture, and so this gives you insight into a time, and it says in the first chapter, this was a time in Israel's life as a country, as a nation, when people really weren't following the rules of God and the law of God, which they had available to them. What they did is they were doing what was best in their own eyes. And that's sort of where we start, that God continuously in the book of Judges, which is the time frame that this is supposed to happen in, is that there are times when the people are called back to faithfulness in God, and that comes along through that story. And then we move to this little snapshot of family life. Now we learned last week that Ruth they'd gone from the tragedy of losing family members, and basically half the original named characters disappear by paragraph 2 in the book. So, and that's just in the first chapter, and it's a hard time. So last week we talked about Ruth was picking up the pieces, and I love the double meaning that I think God gave me that with, and that is she's literally picking up pieces, heads of grain, and putting them in something to carry off, and she's been given permission to glean, and then at the same time they're picking up the pieces of their lives. And there's a lot of kindness going on. Between the first week, Ruth is the one showing kindness because she won't leave her mother-in-law and won't let her go back home alone. And the second week is we have kindness that comes from a new character last week, which was Boaz, and something about some of his staff is they already know who Ruth is. They know what she's been doing on behalf and for her mother-in-law, and so Boaz is the one who gives protection to her and generosity, and he makes sure that they're taken care of, and even allows her to do things that a normal gleaner wouldn't get to do, which was to eat lunch with the staff and even him. So that we moved through that process last week where Ruth has been going out to the fields, and we don't know how much time has passed by the time we start chapter 3, but it could be, I think the way it read last week was the harvest, for the wheat harvest was either in process or almost over at the time of that writing. And so Ruth is constantly referred to as Ruth the Moabite, and that's sort of as a reminder of some history that we'll talk a little bit about today between the two nations. So the last week the tide had turned. They were gone from being two widows with no idea whether they would eat, theoretically, without the generosity of other people in the community. No place to stay, per se, although we were pretty sure that someone took them in, at least for the short term. And then Ruth starts bringing in more than what a typical gleaner gets in a matter of, instead of maybe a pound of seed, she brings in 30 pounds. And Ruth has to tell her mother-in-law where this stuff came from because it just wasn't normal. It's not the way it worked. And so she had found favor with this guy, Boaz. So when we actually looked at the chapter last week, the two people that were prominent in the story, Ruth and Boaz, you saw insights into their character. One is everybody in town is buzzing about Ruth and her character and the things she's doing and how she responds to this hardship. She's a get up and get started herself kind of person. She's taking care of her mother-in-law and herself by gleaning, and it's pretty hard work. And then Boaz hears of this girl, hadn't met her yet until the second chapter last week, and he starts caring for her and making sure she and her her mother-in-law are cared for by being so generous with the availability of to glean very close and to get more of the seeds, which sort of gives them a little bit of capital. They've got enough barley that they can trade, and maybe they can trade for housing, or maybe they can trade, for spices or things. So they're not totally destitute, although they really don't have enough to own a home, but they have enough to be able to get a little extra care for themselves by taking this generosity of Boaz and turning it into something tangible for their daily life. So Ruth has come into the story from the very beginning as a widow, and she has nothing to offer except her time and her efforts and her devotion. She's going to be the caregiver all along through here, and so she comes with nothing, and when she meets Boaz, he has everything. He's described as, depending on which version of translation of Scripture you read, he's either wealthy, some will actually say he's honorable, and we know, if you peeked ahead till next week, and I hope you did, that he actually has a place at the city gate as sort of the local magistrate court, the real court system, or the elders that would sit by the gate, and people would bring their problems and squabbles and problems in their fields, everything. You could go to this group of men who were, very knowledgeable, and most of them were of some wealth from what we read in history. So he comes and he's very full, and God has blessed Bethlehem, and not just Boaz, but everybody in Bethlehem, it seems to be having a good harvest. So the whole story started with a famine. So things have changed. Now Naomi, evidently she's been thinking, things have slowed down on the harvesting, and so, they may have, the whole countertop is filled with jars that say barley, 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 wheat, wheat, wheat. So they got all this technically stuff they can make bread with. And so they're okay, comfortable, and we don't know that Ruth isn't still going out and working, but Naomi's had some time to think, because we don't hear that she goes into the fields at all. She's just sort of staying in the household, watching over things, wherever they are, and she's been thinking. And she starts thinking about the time is that when the barley harvest and the wheat harvest have come in, they spend a lot of time, or the men spend a lot of time at the threshing floor. And she basically tells her daughter-in-law, hey, I've been thinking. You remember that guy Boaz that you go and work in his fields every day? He's a relative. You knew that, right? Because that was sort of a big deal in the past couple of weeks. So the narrator hints it, and then later Ruth knows he's a relative. And so, Ruth knows because of Naomi that he's a relative. And so she says, I've been thinking, we need to find a way to get you a home where you can be taken care of. Because as two widows, how long can they support one another and take care of one another without having something more stable, a household? We've talked about women being property recently, and even in the past, and also something about being a part of a family, which was the most important thing. Land was the second most important thing. And they're connected together. Is that the two go together, because that is the way you get your care. You had to have land to be able to at least raise your own meals, wheat, other products. You might have olives. Depending on the wealth of the landowner, they could have several different kinds of fields with different seasons. Well, if you're only connected by what people give you, then you don't know how long their generosity is going to hold out. So evidently Ruth's going, not Ruth, but Naomi says, hey, I've been thinking, I need to find a good home for you. And, that guy Boaz, he seems like a real good prospect. So why don't we come up with this plan? Go and take a bath. Not as common as it is today. Go take a bath, put on some perfume, and their perfume was a heavy oil that they would put on, and it was very, very aromatic, and then put on your best dress. I doubt she had a bunch of dresses, but put on your best dress, and then I'm going to want you to go down to the threshing floor. I want you to go there, but I don't want you to go onto the threshing floor. I want you to watch for Boaz. And they're going to be down there tonight, and he's going to be there, and after the wind starts blowing, and you can't winnow anymore, everybody's going to have, they're going to have a nice meal that's been planned, and then they're celebrating the harvest, and things are going great, and there's going to be a little drinking, and in a way, it's sort of like saying the commercial Miller time. It's Miller time. The guys are going to be down there, and they're going to be well, they're going to be having a little bit of a barley beer, and it's usually, the language gets a little coarse. They tell stories, but so I don't want you to go into the threshing floor. I want you to Boaz has his field, and he's ready for bed. Watch where he goes, because when it quietens down, I want you to go and lay at his feet, uncover his feet, and just wait. And at some point, he'll notice you, and he'll tell you what to do. Just do whatever he says. I don't know, does that seem shady to y'all? If you had a similar story in today's time, we'd be saying, this is uncomfortable. You see, the threshing floor, during the daytime hours, the threshing floor, all people could be there. In fact, the next day after the men have spent the night there, partially protecting the crop, partially because they were partying a little bit, they would get up the next day and they would start taking this pile of grain and they would put it in bags or jars, and they would be transporting either for storage on the landowner's farm, or it would go right to market, or maybe they pre-sold it and so it would be delivered. So in the daytime, everybody from the fields that normally worked would be there to package it up and get it shipped out and get it moved. And that's not when she tells them to go, because it's at night when the men are working, and it starts in the evening when the breeze comes, and they're roughing up the grain, where they're using animals, but they've already worked all day, and now they're using the wind to blow away the chaff, and they're getting the seeds ready, and they're culling out all the little pieces, and they're putting it in a big pile. And so they've worked pretty hard until really about dark is when the wind dies down. So there's no more breeze. All the stuff's just going to fall right back into the pile. So that's when they set up dinner, and Charlotte probably has Boaz has arranged for his household folks and to prepare it. But it's a place that only the men work, because once it got dark, it wasn't safe for women to travel on their own. So it was, I would equate it to being like you see these TV shows, and the women are walking by some construction site, and the guys are sitting there having their lunch, and they're whistling and jeering them as they go by. And if you took that and added a bit of alcohol to it, that might even go over the top, and somebody might be assaulted in one way or another. That's sort of the environment, although I don't think Boaz had a total intention of anything like that. That's the reason women were not welcome on his threshing floor, because sometimes other people had parties that were maybe wilder than what we would think Boaz affirms here. So it quietens down, and Ruth does as her mother-in-law has instructed. She'd already said she would do it, so she went, and she's doing what she said as she goes over to him, and she quietly uncovers, it says his feet, but some say that it would be all the way up to his waist, and so that he's laying there, and then she lays down, and she's got her shawl, and she's wearing her dress, and so she gets comfortable on the floor. And if you're reading the story in the scripture, it's like, some of them say he wakes up suddenly, or basically I sort of picture it as suddenly he realizes he's not alone. He hears somebody else breathing close by, because he's wandered off a little bit by himself on the other side of the big grain pile, where he supposedly has laid down all by himself. And I wonder, was it the perfume he smelled that made him start? Maybe it was the breathing. Maybe she moved or something. And so he sits up, and he realizes that what he can see in the mostly darkness is that there's, pretty sure it's a young woman. She smells nice. And so he says, "Who's there? Who are you?" Well, it's like, "What are you doing here?" And Ruth answers, "It's your servant Ruth." Now, the last time she sort of introduced herself, she was amazed that he would talk to her at all, and she claimed to be something less than his slave girl from his household. Now she's moved herself up to this sort of a little more status. She's become a servant as far as she's concerned in the household, and he has called her his daughter. He's called her several things that make her welcome. And so he suddenly wakes up. He has this person. It's just like, he's not alone in his sleeping bag anymore. It's something else is going on, and he is uncertain, and she introduces herself to say, "It's just me." And then she leaves the script that Naomi gave her. Instead of just waiting for him to say something, or waiting to say, "Oh, come here and talk to me," before he says anything except saying who she is, she asks him to cover her or protect her with his garment. take me into your family. He calls him a kinsman redeemer, or depending on your translation, it can be family redeemer, it can be guardian redeemer. There were people within the Israelite community that were the redeemers for the family. So if a family member got in trouble, a family member was murdered, they would take care of redeeming land, redeeming people if they went to jail, if someone was accused, that they would arrange for the family to be cared for. In this case, Boaz is in the category, he's a close enough relative to be considered a redeemer, but he's not exactly the one that she needs to be talking to in this case. So she has asked him, okay, Naomi was playing matchmaker. She has decided that it was worth some risk to send Ruth to a place where only men are supposed to be, a place that if discovered there, people are going to be wagging their tongues because they're going to, I know what was going on there. We don't know anybody does that, I'm sure. They're going to be, it would ruin Ruth's growing reputation. People have already been wagging their tongues about her, but it's been in positive ways. It's been her care of her mother-in-law. It's been her hard working to make sure they can eat. It's been the positive things. And Boaz has witnessed this as well, that he's not only, she's a hard worker so much that she hardly takes a break, and she seems grateful for everything that he has done for her. She had told her mother-in-law, yeah, I'll do it. Whatever you say, Mama, I'll do what you say. And you start thinking, well, if her mother-in-law is worried about finding her husband, that sounds like a good thing. But she's real specific about the husband she intends for Ruth to find. Boaz has been good to them. So Naomi's saying, well, better to have one man in the hand than somebody she might meet on the street. It's we need somebody to take care of her, and because I'm her mother-in-law, because I'm in the same family, I'll also be in that household. I'll have the advantage of having a home as long as I live. Now, I'm not saying her motives are that negative. It's just a possibility. Maybe it is pure love of her daughter-in-law. Maybe. It just seems too much in her favor. And then just to tell her to go and do this and take a risk and maybe ruin her reputation. Several things could happen when she went and uncovered him and waited for him to wake up. And when she called him Redeemer, she was basically saying, marry me. I know it doesn't say that in word for word, but what the Redeemer did was to recover the land. And the way she would be a part of that is if he married her, then her children would take and be blessed by the father, but the father's name would live on in the community because her husband this would be any children they had would be credited to her husband and let their family line live on, which had been Elimelech's line, which was now terminated. The land would be lost if we didn't find a way to have an heir, because it only could be passed on to men. When Boaz is brought into the picture, the idea of redeeming that land, redeeming the family name, in Naomi's eyes is huge. All she does is give some simple instructions, but I'm really bothered by the danger she's put her daughter-in-law in. So I wonder about that love, but that's just me guessing and thinking. And as I told you, I have a theater in my mind that I think pass these through. So it just happened that this Boaz guy was a member of the family. It just happened that he was rich. I'm going to guess that maybe he was distinguished, if not handsome. Now, did I mention he's rich? That doesn't influence anything, does it? They didn't have online dating back then. I did look into that a little bit this morning. No, I did not sign up for any official site. I was trying to figure out what the criteria was. I didn't find as much as I'd hoped to find. And when I sent the title to Miss Joanne, I just picked Match.com because I guess it's the one I see on the TV commercials the most when I see those. And it could be any of those sites, I guess. It could be, maybe it should have been Farmer.com. I remember that one now. Is people with similar interests. But what are the differences and the similarities? Could or would Ruth and Boaz in today's culture have been put together? And there are several things that are wrong with the relationship. You see, the problem is they're from really different backgrounds. Boaz has probably a hard worker, and he's older than her, and she's younger. That's a problem that probably would meet red flags on those little criteria sheets that somebody fills in. Their cultures and even the Moabites didn't get along so much that they were banished from the presence of God. Israelites banished the Moabites from ever being in the presence of God in the temple or a worship service for 10 generations. I think that's a grudge. That's a long time. That's probably for as long as you can imagine. Boaz is on the top of the economic ladder in Bethlehem, and Ruth is below the bottom rung. She's living on the blessings and the grace and the kindness, mostly of Boaz. So she's lower than one of her servants in her description. As I said, the ages are a problem. He's considered to be considerably older, maybe twice her age, maybe more. Ruth was a Moabite. Boaz is a Jew. The Moabites, there's a hard history if you go back into when the Israelites came into the Promised Land. Now, Naomi's criteria was a little different because I'm not sure that we would see Match.com or eHarmony or any of those would match them up. There are just too many opposites that would make it so they weren't very similar. Well, Naomi starts with one characteristic that's most important. He's a near relative. Check. Okay, he's a relative. It's got to be a relative in her mind because that's the only way any kind of redemption would ever be possible, only way her security can be made whole. And so then we, got to remember that in the Jewish family, that culture thing is important, and she overlooks the fact that a Moabite and a Jew really would have been looked down upon as getting married, but there's the offset that Boaz has a really, really high character, and Ruth's character is not where they considered the typical Moabite to be. She was somewhere on the rise, and just seeing her living the right way, her coming to worship, and her accepting the God of Israel, but she was still a Moabite girl. Now, Ruth and Boaz are both adults. This isn't a relationship where there's going to be someone has to give somebody away. The only thing that needs to happen is these two people need to say, yeah, we're going to get married, and the only thing that really has to happen is they have sex. They don't have to have any of the formal things. There's no breaking of the glass and all those things we see in Jewish wedding. Back in the day, it was that simple. In fact, in other places in Scripture, you'll find that where someone rapes someone, they still would technically be called married people because there's a lot of things you can fix in your relationship with people. Being generous, you can change whether you're going to keep being generous or not. Being protective, that can go and come. But the thing about the sex act was you don't get to take it back. In their culture, the Jewish culture, it was a commitment. And this is also in the time when you could be married to more than one person, even in Israel. So you could end up picking up a few lives along the way, depending on how you live your life. Now, here's part of that risk. Ruth is on the bottom of the scale, and Boaz on the top. If they had taken action on the threshing floor, who's going to believe her? She's a Moabite girl. He's got a reputation, so there was a risk. Now, he could have just rejected her too. He could have changed his opinion about her because she's made this approach to him. He did not know he was on the short list of an eligible bachelor for her next husband. So he could have been in shock enough to say, "Just go away from here, kick her out," and it would change everything about. If he quit supporting them, it would change everything. So this was a huge risk that she was asked to perform. Back then, you didn't get as young children or at a certain age it changed over. There was a certain amount of purple that wasn't allowed. I know y'all probably don't want to know what I mean by purple. If you have pink and you're blue, and that's the way you're supposed to be. The girls were rarely with the boys after a certain age, and the boys were, they could see each other, they could talk, but there was really no dating, none of those things. And so if you put pink and blue together, you get purple. And so the rule in some events I've worked with teenagers is, pink is fine, blue is fine, no purple. Being in the same room, no purple. No purple outside by the doors in the dark. Okay, so in this case, she has gone to the dark threshing floor when most people sleep, maybe all the people are asleep, and she's going to this man that Naomi believes is a good catch. He's got everything that Naomi's looking for. So Ruth goes and is technically purple because a woman should not be at the threshing floor for her own safety. We know they drink on there. Naomi even knows. She's been a farmer's wife in the same town. She knows what happens out on the threshing floor during the season when they're breaking everything up, and yet she still risks everything by making her own suggestion, maybe even command her daughter-in-law to, quote, make her life better, to find her a husband. Get dolled up, go down in the dark, and hang out. So Ruth actually makes the connection verbally to being a redeemer for her family. She doesn't wait for the instructions that Naomi thought would come. She tells her, go ahead. Just go. She just says things like, hey, you're my redeemer. I'd like you to do that. And so she's asking to not just be married to him and have an okay life and a good life, but if he's the redeemer, he's going to restore the land and reconnect it to the family and do it on behalf of her husband. And by the way, we don't know which son was her husband. It doesn't say in the story, just Mahlon, Chilion. So one of those two brothers. So he tells her, don't be afraid. The whole town knows your character. I know your character. I'm very impressed with you. And while I am the kinsman redeemer, I'm not the first in line for responsibility for redeeming your family. So you can hear the music going, like da da da. Something else is wrong. Somebody else is in the mix. He tells her to stay the night. Go ahead, stay there at my feet, and in the morning I'll go out and go to your first line kinsman redeemer, and I will resolve this issue for you. Aren't those romantic words? Sounds like a business deal, doesn't it? It is a business deal. It is his responsibility. It's really the other guy's responsibility first, but he says he's going to make this right. He's going to give the person whose responsibility and privilege it is to be her redeemer, he's going to give him that chance. And that's what we'll look at next week. So he's going to go that day and deal with that. And then he gets her to lay out her shawl, and he fills it up, and it says with 6 measures of barley. And it was sort of like I told you I guess last week. It means a lot. Because if we know an ephah was considered to be 30 pounds, it could be more, it could be less. We don't know what the size of a measure of barley was, but it was heavy. And so they wrap it up, put it in her shawl, she carries it back, and she goes through the early light. Early light is just enough to be able to see what's going on, a little bit of dawn in the sky, but nobody can really recognize her. So in a way, it could be a couple of things. It could be that it looks like she has gone to the threshing floor to get some grain and take it back. Maybe went and made a quick purchase early in the morning, or maybe it's just he was trying to get her gone because he can't go with her, because if they were seen together, those tongues, they'll wag. But she can see well enough to see the path, and she can get back to her home. And so when she gets back, Naomi's like, well, what happened? Okay, I think it was really an understatement. It only shows us, a quick story. Well, tell me what happened. No, I think she was excited. I think she'd been up half the night, maybe all night, pacing, going, well, man, she's got to come back. I just need to know what's happened here. I don't know that the question of is she okay came up, or where this was going. Maybe it was a good sign, sort of like they say, jury trial. If it takes a while for the jury to come back, maybe you're going to get off. Maybe it's that where she's thinking, well, okay, this probably went well. You see, I think she's expecting her to come back as Mrs. Boaz. But the character of the two people, and we'll say especially Boaz, because he knew that he was not eligible to be that man that would take on the land, which means he would take her as a wife automatically. And so he has sent her back saying he'll handle it and they'll get a resolution. And so when she asks her, well, did you get married? Well, no, we talked. We just talked a little while, and then I came back and look, I brought all this grain, and so here's another healthy portion. Basically, she adds to the story and tells you, well, he said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Now, I don't know if there's a lot of meaning in this. His act of generosity was all the way up to this point. If the other man chooses to be the redeemer, Boaz can't be the redeemer, can't be quite as generous anymore, because it's the other man's responsibility. In fact, that's one of the reasons Boaz can't act, is if he had decided, yes, he'd already said, yes, I'll marry you, I'll do that. But the big problem was, if he did that without working with the one who was closer, then technically he is stealing both the responsibility and the benefits that come with getting used to that land until the child grows up on his own, when the child comes along. Maybe even keeping the land forever, because if they don't produce a child. Because another problem with Ruth is we don't know if she can have children till next week. We'll talk about that. So Boaz, if he acts, it ruins his righteousness. If he had sent her away, fine. He could have done that gently. If he had chosen, yes, I'm going to marry you and do it now, that's where the problem came up. It wasn't that it wasn't legitimate to make that decision. Now, I think Naomi probably sent it because, well, if he's been drinking, it's easier to get a man to say yes to a lot of things if your belly's full. And Boaz doesn't change in his character. He knows someone else is the appropriate person to go to. Marriage back then probably was less about romance and infatuated love as it was a business deal. Whether you were young and a child and parents were making that decision, or a matchmaker was involved, the dedication and romance and love that comes with marriage probably in their time came more sometime after the first child was born, when there was a common entity between the two people that bonded them in a permanent way. So Ruth has come back. She's giving her story. And even at that point, there's the hesed love of Boaz. His kindness, his generosity is there. And in the whole chapter, they don't mention God. In the whole chapter, and not very often in the book, the whole book do they mention God, but Boaz seems to be the character that consistently is offering the hesed relationship, the totally unrestricted kindness, generosity, protection, and love to Ruth, and ultimately to Naomi. So here this foreigner is, and she has a righteous man, a man of valor, a man of loving kindness that is going to go and solve the relationship problems that will put Ruth and Naomi into a more comfortable situation, something more permanent, at least for their lifetimes. This week, Naomi pushes the story by suggesting that it's her duty to get her married. And at the same time, she pushes, supposedly out of love for Ruth, to take risks that can ruin everything about her relationship with that community. I don't know. I don't know if Naomi's character is clear. She's been very negative as we've gone through this book. But also, I can't say that she doesn't have the right thing at heart. We don't know enough about it. We just know that there's this risk that worries me, that I would have trouble considering sending my children or my daughter into that kind of situation and hoping for the best. The norms of interaction with God in the culture where people were connected to the law, and if they followed the law, they were not just consulting their own idea of what right and wrong was. So Naomi had her own view, and maybe there's a reference in the law to what she had suggested, but more likely the people that are really following the law most closely would be Ruth, who expressed her desire or her availability to be married, and Boaz, instead of just saying yes instantly and being flattered by her attention and taking personal action, he says, we've got to do this. So in the darkness of the threshing floor is not the place to make deals. It's in the light of day, which is what we'll hear next week. I think the story speaks to right actions. Not our own actions Sometimes our own actions, if they're molded by the right actions, by God's leading, then we're on the right path. The guidelines of the law of Moses were pretty specific. We don't follow the law of Moses, but we follow the love of Jesus and our relationship with God through Him. Jesus' selfless actions, Boaz's selfless actions, benefit life. Promote life. Life in this place and eternal life. If we don't have those kind of guidelines, we're making our own decisions, just as it was described in the book of Judges, which was a big spiraling negative time in Israel's history where God had to continually send corrective actions. So if you haven't read through Ruth, I hope that you'll read through it, or maybe reread it and pick up some more character information and decide maybe which one of the characters you might be most aligned with. Sometimes we can be negative. Sometimes we can be gracious and loving and giving. Sometimes we can be selfless to the point that all we can do is give ourselves because we don't have anything else to give. Maybe you need to find where you are in the story. All glory be to God. So next week is the big surprise ending. Okay, it's not really that big a surprise probably. It's how God shows up that we'll be paying attention to and how His kindness continues to be given to them.